You're listening to Big World Network.
The Caves of Bluestone, Episode 1, written by Philip McCormack, read by Claire McCormack. Carol crouched in the bushes and stared across at the city. Clad in skins of various hues, he blended perfectly into the undergrowth. Even his hat was made from the skin of a small mammal. The tail was still attached and hung down his back. A dagger and an axe dangled from a leather belt around his waist. The city stretched before him, further than the eye could see, the outlines bleak and inhospitable as the sun highlighted the towering, indistinct surfaces. The sun did not lend any warmth to the buildings. They appeared cold and hard, and absorbed the rays of the sun as if the city was built from blocks of grey ice. Flying machines lifted up from the city like great buzzing insects before zooming off towards the horizon. Similar machines arrived just as suddenly over the city and hovered for a time before descending out of sight. The fur-clad boy tensed. He saw movement on the flat grassland on the outskirts of the great city. He brought a small pair of fold-up binoculars to his eyes. They revealed a black snake of vehicles exiting the city. The convoy moved rapidly, although at that distance it merely seemed to be crawling. For a long time he watched. The vehicles bounced across the uneven ground, for outside the city no proper roads existed. When he was satisfied he knew in what direction the convoy was headed, he folded the glasses and stored them in a leather pouch on his belt. He turned and crawled back through the bushes until he came to a small copse. Cautiously he stood, his eyes scanning back and forth, testing his surroundings for signs of danger. Satisfied all was well, he glided silently through the trees and out the other side of the wood. A large, shaggy wolfhound, almost as tall as the boy, rose from the grass and launched itself at him. Carol gave way, trying to fend off the animal, but he was no match for the ferocious strength of the giant brute. He fell to the ground with the great hound slavering over him. "Samson, behave yourself. I was only gone 10 minutes." The dog persisted in its enthusiastic welcome. At last the boy flung his arms around the dog's neck and hugged hard. "It's all right, Samson. I won't abandon you, I promise. I need you as much as you need me." The big animal, seemingly satisfied the boy was all right, left off his greeting and eagerly watched his master. The boy reached out and stroked the massive head. "I spotted them, Samson. I've marked the direction they're heading. We'll follow them." Recovering his equipment, which included a spear made from a stout pole with the blade fastened to one end, the boy set off at a brisk walk. Beside him trotted the huge dog with a couple of panniers strapped across his broad back. It was early afternoon, and ahead of the youngster stretched gorse-covered low hills. Carol kept up the steady ground-eating pace for the rest of the day. The dog loped easily along behind him. As they travelled, both dog and boy kept an alert watch on the countryside around them. Except for a few startled deer and a small herd of goats, nothing distracted them from their steady progress northwards. As evening approached, the boy perceived a wood ahead. With some caution, Carol and his dog entered the trees. Once inside the shelter of the wood, he stood still, listening and sniffing the air for signs of danger. Once or twice he looked at the dog as if for reassurance. Seeing the dog showed no sign of uneasiness, Carol proceeded further into the trees until eventually they came to a glade. An ancient ruin stood at the centre of the clearing. Remaining in the shadow of the undergrowth, Carol watched the building for some time before coming to the conclusion it was deserted. "Samson, it looks as if we found shelter for the night." But Samson paid him no heed. Instead, he crouched low and growled at something in the long grass. The boy readied his spear and watched Samson intently. The huge dog continued to growl as it moved cautiously forward, its body tense and expectant. There was a sudden flurry of movement, and something hissed and spat at Samson. The dog retreated, rumbling low in its throat. Carol inched forward, holding his spear before him, until at last he caught sight of the thing that had disturbed the dog. Crouched in the grass, lips drawn back in a vicious snarl, a wildcat spat a warning. As Carol observed the cat, it rolled to its side, revealing extended teats. Somewhere she had kits. Even so, apart from hissing at them, it did not appear that the animal was about to attack. Slowly Carol relaxed. Briefly, he wondered why the wildcat did not flee. Then he saw the short arrow protruding from her shoulder. It was obvious the wounded cat had dragged herself into the long grass and lain low, hidden from any casual observer. However, the keen nose of the dog had found her. "Heel, Samson." With the dog safely by his side, Carol moved closer, the better to observe the wildcat. She was evidently in great pain. He instinctively knew who had committed the wanton act. No one but a savage would have shot an animal and left it to die. "They got you as well, Kitty. Well, we have a common enemy now. They shot Samson here and left him to die, just as they've done for you." As Carol talked, slowly he moved closer to the wounded wildcat and studied the position of the arrowhead. All the while the animal snarled and hissed at him. He knew if he left her without extracting that arrow, she would die a slow, agonizing death. Backing away from the wounded cat, Carol reached into one of the panniers strapped to the dog's back and rummaged about. Finding what he wanted, he drew out a pair of heavy gauntlets and donned them. If he was to help the pain-crazed animal, he knew he had to protect himself from her sharp teeth and vicious claws. His voice low and soothing, he moved towards the wildcat. The cat watched him suspiciously, growling low in her throat, her lips drawn back in a snarl that exposed her cruel teeth. The youngster tossed a few scraps of dried rabbit meat to the animal. The wild cat ignored the meat, and the growling grew in intensity. Slowly, Carol stretched out his gloved hand. The cat's growling rose several pitches. She struggled to stand, but the arrow in her shoulder hampered her movements, and she fell back in the grass. The boy moved the gloved hand closer. The wildcat struck, the razor-sharp claws slicing into the thick leather of the glove. The boy winced as some of the barbs penetrated and found the soft flesh of his hand. With a sharp intake of breath, he tried to ignore the pain and kept his hand where it was. In spite of her weakened condition, the cat savagely attacked the glove, growling fiercely and biting viciously into the tough leather. Cautiously, Carol reached forwards with his other hand and gripped the shaft of the arrow. The cat was still engrossed in savaging the gloved hand. With a quick jerk, he wrenched the arrow from her shoulder. For an instant, the cat eased her grip on the glove and squealed in pain. Momentarily she went still, and then, releasing the mutilated glove, fell back in the grass, mewling softly She eyed the crouching boy and then arched her neck and examined the dark blood oozing from the hole in her shoulder. She glared balefully at the boy for a moment longer, still keeping a wary eye on him. The wildcat began to lick the wound. Carol stood up. He was sweating, and his lacerated hand throbbed with pain. He could feel the inside of the glove was sticky with blood. The wildcat gave him a cautionary growl when she saw him stand up, but did not desist from her licking. It seemed to sense now that he did not intend to harm her. He had removed the shaft of pain that had disabled her. The wildcat carried on washing the wound. The boy bent down and placed some more of the rabbit meat near the wounded wildcat, then turned and entered the deserted building. Unbuckling the panniers strapped on the dog, he unpacked and made camp. Then he cleaned and dressed the punctures in his hand. He examined the gauntlet and marvelled at the cuts in the heavy material. Grimacing ruefully, he thought of the damage the cat could have inflicted if he had not worn the tough leather glove. Taking a box of matches from one of the packs, he soon had a cheery fire going. Samson stretched contentedly in the heat. The boy prepared a simple meal for himself and ate slowly. Some weeks had passed since that terrible afternoon. Carol had returned home from a fishing trip to find his home wrecked, his father and mother murdered, and his twin sister Becky missing. While he had spent an idle few hours fishing down by the river, the savages had ridden through his home and wrecked their lives. Half crazed with grief and anguish, he had prepared his mother and father for burial. Standing over the shallow grave containing their mutilated bodies, his grief had transformed into bitter thoughts of revenge. Later, as he searched through the ruins of their homestead for signs of his sister, he had found the dog Samson lying in a welter of blood. Around the great dog had lain the bodies of several of the hellhounds, fierce animals that accompanied their brutal masters. The huge dog had managed to kill and mutilate those beasts before succumbing to a hail of arrows. When Carol prepared the dog for burial, a low moan from the animal had shocked and frightened him. Then, hoping to salvage something from the wreckage of his home, instead of a grave, he prepared a bed for the dog. Carol's sorrow over the deaths of his parents had been temporarily forgotten as he tended to his faithful pet and companion. The wolfhound was his one link with the past, and he utilised all the skills his parents had taught him in his efforts to save the dog's life. Days had passed as he nursed the dog and waited for it to regain its strength. During that time his grim resolve to find the brutes who had destroyed his family grew within him. To fill in the time while he waited for Samson to recover, he made his preparations to leave the family home, perhaps never to return. With much thought and care, he chose foods, spare clothes and weapons to take with him. He did not need to carry a large amount of food, for he knew he could live off the land as his mother and father had trained him. Under Carol's tender nursing, Samson had slowly recovered, and when at last the hound was strong enough to accompany him, without a backward glance he had walked away from the ruined farm where his mother and father lay in their graves. His grim mission in life now was to find the savage band that had killed his parents and rescue his sister if she was still alive.
You're listening to Big World Network.
Music by Kevin MacLeod.